The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen plains of Montana Territory, carrying with it the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes. Jack Morrison stood on the porch of his ranch house, squinting into the white darkness, watching the snow fall so thick it seemed the sky itself was collapsing. He'd sent his ranch hands home hours ago, told them to hunker down with their families before the storm got worse. Now he was alone, just him and the 100 head of cattle that represented everything he'd worked for in the 5 years since he'd staked his claim out here in the middle of nowhere. He was about to turn back inside when he saw something that made his heart stop. A figure, small and dark against the white, stumbling through the drifts near the far fence line. At first he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the storm, but then he saw it fall and struggle to rise again. Without thinking, Jack grabbed his coat and plunged into the blizzard, fighting his way through snow that was already knee-deep and rising. When he reached her, she was on her hands and knees, shaking so violently he could see it even through the sheets of snow. Her lips were blue, her face pale as death itself. She looked up at him with eyes that held a desperate kind of hope, and he recognized her immediately. Sarah Brennan, the daughter of Thomas Brennan, whose ranch bordered his to the east. He'd seen her in town a few times, always from a distance, always wondered about the sadness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. "Come inside now, I can't leave you out here freezing," he said, wrapping his coat around her trembling shoulders. She tried to protest, tried to say something, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. He lifted her like she weighed nothing at all and carried her back through the storm, leaning into the wind that tried to push them both down into the snow's cold embrace. Inside, he set her by the fireplace and piled on more logs until the flames roared with heat. He brought blankets, hot coffee, whatever he could find to drive the cold from her bones. For a long time she just sat there, wrapped in wool and misery, staring into the fire like it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. Jack gave her space, busied himself checking the windows and doors, making sure the storm couldn't find its way in. Finally, when some color had returned to her cheeks and her hands had stopped shaking, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost lost beneath the wind's fury outside. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have come here. I didn't know where else to go." Jack pulled up a chair across from her, keeping a respectful distance. "You're welcome here," he said simply. "But what were you doing out in this? Nobody with sense would be traveling in weather like this." Her eyes filled with tears then, and she looked away, ashamed. "I ran away," she whispered. "From my father's ranch. From him." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She told him about her father, Thomas Brennan, the man everyone in the territory knew as a successful rancher and respected citizen. But behind closed doors, she said, he was something else entirely. A tyrant who ruled his household with fists and fury, who'd driven her mother to an early grave and now turned his cruelty on Sarah and her younger brother. She told him about the beatings, about the constant fear, about how she'd endured it all because she thought she had to, because she didn't know what else to do. But tonight, she said, her father had gone too far. He'd hit her brother, little Michael, who was only 14, hit him so hard he'd knocked him unconscious. When Sarah had tried to intervene, her father had turned on her with a rage she'd never seen before. She'd managed to get away, had run out into the storm without thinking, had just kept running until she couldn't run anymore. Jack listened to it all, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. He'd heard rumors about Thomas Brennan, whispers in town about his temper, but he'd never known it was this bad. Nobody had known, or maybe nobody had wanted to know. It was easier to look away, to pretend that what happened behind a man's door was his own business. "My brother," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I left him there. I left Michael alone with him." Jack stood up, his mind racing. The storm outside was getting worse by the minute. The temperature had to be well below zero, and visibility was down to nothing. Going out there now would be suicide. But he looked at Sarah's face, saw the guilt and fear and desperation there, and he knew he couldn't just sit here and do nothing. "I'll go get him," he said. Sarah's eyes went wide. "You can't. The storm, you'll die out there." "I know this land," Jack said, pulling on his heavy coat, his gloves, wrapping a scarf around his face. "I've ridden through worse." It was a lie, but a necessary one. He hadn't ridden through worse. Nobody had. This was the kind of storm that people told stories about years later, the kind that killed cattle and men with equal indifference. That he saddled his best horse, a sturdy mare named Duchess who'd carried him through hard times before. Before he left, he looked at Sarah one more time. "If I don't make it back," he said, "there's food and firewood enough for a month. The deed to this place is in the desk in my bedroom. Do what you want with it." "Don't talk like that," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't go. Please." But he was already gone, swallowed by the white fury of the storm. The ride to the Brennan Ranch should have taken 20 minutes. It took Jack nearly 2 hours. He couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, had to trust Duchess to find her way, had to trust his own sense of direction honed by years of working this land. The cold was beyond anything he'd ever experienced. It crept through his layers of clothing, found every gap, every opening, tried to freeze the blood in his veins. His face burned where the wind touched it, his hands ached even inside thick gloves. More than once he thought about turning back, about letting the storm win. But then he'd think of that boy, 14 years old and alone with a monster, and he'd push on. When he finally saw the lights of the Brennan Ranch house, he almost wept with relief. He tied Duchess to the porch rail and pounded on the door. No answer. He pounded again, harder, and finally the door swung open to reveal Thomas Brennan himself, tall and broad-shouldered, with the red face of a man who'd been drinking. "What the hell do you want, Morrison?" Brennan growled. "I've come for the boy," Jack said. "For Michael." Brennan's expression darkened. "You've got no business here. That girl send you? Where is she?" "Somewhere safe," Jack said. "Somewhere you'll never hurt her again. Now I'm taking Michael, and you're not going to stop me." Brennan laughed, a mean, ugly sound. "You're going to take my son? You think you can just walk into my house and take what's mine?" "He's not property," Jack said. "He's a child. And I'm not leaving without him." What happened next happened fast. Brennan took a swing at Jack, connected with his jaw hard enough to make stars explode behind his eyes. Jack stumbled back but didn't go down. He'd been in plenty of fights, had the scars to prove it, and he knew how to take a punch. He came back swinging, caught Brennan in the ribs, then in the face. They fought there in the doorway, two men locked in brutal combat while the storm raged around them. Jack was younger, faster, but Brennan was bigger and fighting with the fury of a man who saw his whole world slipping away. They crashed through the door and into the house, knocked over furniture, broke a lamp. Jack's nose was bleeding, his lip split, but he kept fighting. He thought of Sarah's face, of the fear in her eyes, and he fought harder. Finally, He got Brennan in a headlock and squeezed until the bigger man's struggles weakened. "Stay down," Jack gasped. "I don't want to hurt you more than I have to." "Michael," he called out. "Michael Brennan, if you're here, come out now." There was a long moment of silence, and then a door opened down the hall. A boy emerged, thin and pale, with a bruise darkening his left eye. He looked terrified, looked at his father still struggling weakly in Jack's grip, looked at Jack like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "It's all right," Jack said. "Your sister sent me. She's safe. I'm taking you to her." The boy hesitated, then nodded. He grabbed a coat and followed Jack out into the storm without looking back. Jack released Brennan, who collapsed to the floor, breathing hard. "You touch these children again," Jack said, "and I'll kill you." "That's not a threat. It's a promise." The ride back was harder than the ride out. Jack was exhausted, bleeding, his body screaming with pain from the fight and the cold. Michael sat in front of him on Duchess, huddled against Jack's chest, shaking but silent. The boy was tough, Jack realized. He'd had to be, to survive what he'd survived. When they finally made it back to Jack's ranch house, Sarah was waiting by the window, watching. She flung open the door and pulled her brother into her arms, sobbing. Jack stumbled inside and collapsed into a chair, feeling like every muscle in his body had turned to water. Sarah tended to his wounds with gentle hands, cleaning the blood from his face, bandaging his split knuckles. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you, thank you." He waved her off, embarrassed by her gratitude, but inside he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Meaning. Like maybe his life out here in the middle of nowhere meant something after all. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days during which Jack, Sarah, and Michael were trapped together in the ranch house. 3 days during which they slowly began to feel like something that might, someday, become a family. Sarah cooked meals that reminded Jack of his childhood, of his own mother who died when he was young. Michael followed Jack around like a shadow, asking endless questions about ranching and horses and what it was like to be on your own in the world. Jack found himself answering patiently, found himself thinking about the future in ways he never had before. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sun came out for the first time in what felt like forever, turning the snow-covered landscape into a blinding sea of white diamonds. Jack went out to check on his cattle and found he'd lost nearly a dozen head, frozen where they stood. It was a hard blow, one that would hurt come spring, but it could have been worse. Much worse. When he came back inside, he found Sarah making coffee, Michael feeding logs into the fireplace. They both looked up when he entered, and there was something in their faces that made his heart ache. Hope. They were looking at him with hope, like he was the answer to questions they'd been asking all their lives. "I was thinking," Sarah said carefully, not meeting his eyes. "Michael and I, we can't go back. And we don't have anywhere else to go. I know it's a lot to ask, but maybe we could stay here. I can cook and clean, help around the ranch. Michael's a hard worker when given the chance. We won't be a burden, I promise." Jack looked at them both, at this broken little family that had stumbled into his life in the middle of a blizzard. He thought about his lonely years out here, about all the nights he'd sat alone by this fire wondering what it was all for. He thought about the future, about what it might look like with people to share it with. "This ranch is too big for one man anyway," he said finally. "I could use the help. But I need to be straight with you both. Your father's not going to let this go. He'll come for you, or he'll send the law. We need to be ready for that. Sarah nodded slowly. I know. But whatever comes, at least we'll face it together. A week later, Thomas Brennan did come, but not in the way Jack expected. He rode up to the ranch house alone, looking 10 years older than he had the night of the storm. He sat on his horse for a long time, just looking at the house, and then he rode away without saying a word. Jack heard later that Brennan had sold his ranch and moved back east, that he'd told everyone his children had died in the storm. It was easier that way, Jack supposed. Easier to pretend they were dead than to admit what he'd done to them. Spring came slowly to Montana Territory that year, but when it finally arrived it was glorious. The snow melted, revealing grass so green it hurt to look at. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion. The cattle that had survived the winter grew fat and healthy. And in the middle of it all, Jack, Sarah, and Michael built something new together. Jack taught Michael everything he knew about ranching, about reading the land and the weather, about how to gentle a horse and mend a fence. The boy soaked it up like rain on dry earth, grew stronger and more confident with each passing day. Sarah transformed the ranch house into a real home, filled it with cooking smells and laughter and the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and Jack, for his part, found himself falling in love. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly and inevitably, like snow accumulating on a winter's night. He loved the way Sarah hummed while she worked, the way she challenged him when she thought he was wrong, the strength he saw in her every single day. She'd been through hell and come out the other side still kind, still hopeful, still believing that tomorrow might be better than today. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Jack reached out and took Sarah's hand. She didn't pull away. They sat there in comfortable silence, while Michael played with one of the ranch dogs in the yard, and Jack thought about that night in the storm, about how sometimes the hardest moments bring the greatest gifts. I never thanked you properly, Sarah said quietly. For saving us. For giving us a home. You saved yourselves, Jack said. You were brave enough to run, brave enough to ask for help. I just opened a door. You did more than that, she said. You gave us a future. A life. Hope. Jack squeezed her hand gently. You gave me those things too. I didn't know it at the time, but I was dying out here. Slowly, maybe, but dying all the same. You and Michael, you brought this place to life. You brought me to life. They married that fall, with Michael standing proud as best man and half the territory in attendance. It was a simple ceremony, held right there on the ranch under a sky so blue it looked painted on. As Jack slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger, as he looked into her eyes and saw his whole future reflected there, he thought about how strange life was. How sometimes you had to walk through a storm to find your way home. How sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. How love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth braving any blizzard to protect. The ranch prospered over the years. Michael grew into a fine young man, eventually starting his own spread on adjacent land. Sarah's laughter filled the house Jack had once thought would always echo with loneliness. They had children of their own, 3 daughters who grew up wild and free on the Montana plains, who learned to ride before they could walk and who knew, bone deep, that they were loved, and sometimes, on winter nights when the wind howled and the snow fell thick, Jack would stand on his porch and remember that storm, that desperate girl stumbling through the drifts, that moment when he'd made the choice to step into the cold and fight for something that mattered. He'd remember wrapping his coat around Sarah's frozen shoulders and carrying her home, never knowing that in saving her life he'd also saved his own. The ranch hands would sometimes see him standing there, smiling into the darkness, and they'd wonder what he was thinking about. But Jack never told them. Some stories were too precious to share, too personal to put into words. Some moments belonged only to the people who'd lived them, who'd survived them, who'd come out the other side transformed.